You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
On this season of Bad Watchdog, we unpack the Project on Government Oversight's exclusive investigations uncovering the abuse of people in the Department of Homeland Security's immigration detention, and how another threat has infiltrated the agency's own ranks.
It only takes one insider to undermine federal law enforcement attempts to go after crime fighters like these.
Listen and subscribe to Bad Watchdog Season 2 wherever you get your podcasts, starting June 20th.
If you like this podcast, can we recommend another one? It's called Big Picture Science. You can hear it wherever you get your podcasts, and its name tells part of the story. The big picture questions and the most interesting research in science.
Seth and I are the hosts. Seth is a scientist. I am Molly, and I'm a science journalist. And we talk to people smarter than us, and we have fun along the way. The show is called Big Picture Science, and as Seth said, you can hear it wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 204, The Fall of France. Well, what about that Maginot thing? This week, a big thank you goes out to Grady for their support of the podcast by becoming a member. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. The Maginot Line occupies an interesting place within the overall history of the German invasion of France in 1940. It was built during the interwar years to act as a force multiplier for the French defenders, to make up for the demographic, geographic, and industrial challenges that the French knew that they would face in a war with Germany. I've covered, this topic in a whole episode 61. If you don't remember, go check it out. Then, when the German invasion actually started, the Germans did exactly what the French expected them to do. They went around the Maginot Line to the north. Now, of course, the Germans did not go as far north as the French expected, going through the Ardennes instead of through central Belgium, but they did go around the Maginot Line like they were supposed to. The complete disasters that then beset the French army have been well covered over the last few months of the podcast, and the collapse of the French resistance left all of the forces still manning the Maginot defenses in an interesting position. They had been specially trained and prepared to occupy the Maginot Line and to defend it against any possible German attack. But then those German attacks didn't happen. As things fell apart north and east of Paris, troops were pulled out of the Maginot Line, with the interval troops pulled out to turn into field divisions for use elsewhere, a measure essentially mandated by the frantic search for more French soldiers to replace those lost earlier in the campaign. For the most part, these were not the troops that actually manned the forts and prepared positions, the gros and petit ouvrages, the casemates, and other such fortifications, but instead the troops that were positioned between them to prevent German infiltration attacks. While repositioning these troops was felt to be necessary, it also introduced a fatal weakness into the defenses, and so orders were also sent out to sabotage and abandon all of the Maginot fortifications. But then another order was sent out that the defenders should defend to the limits of their abilities to tie up as many German troops as possible. The result of this last order was that the Maginot defenders would continue fighting longer than any other unit in France. Even after the signing of the armistice, their resistance continued, in some cases until June 25th, which is when the Ouvrage du Froment would give the final order to cease fire, ending the fighting in France. Speaking of the Ouvrage du Froment, it would be one of the areas that would see serious action during the opening days of the German attack. The Ouvrage was positioned near the northern reaches of the Maginot Line, and was only about 60 kilometers southeast of Sedan, where Guderian would cross the Meuse. Du Froment was similar to some of the other sort of gross or great ouvrages of the Maginot Line, in that it had distributed fortifications. This meant that it was built out of a series of different types of blocks or kind of self-contained underground units. In the case of Du Froment, there were 7 blocks. The combat blocks were located on the northern side of the fortification, the direction that the Germans were expected to attack from. These would be either artillery or infantry blocks, with the artillery blocks featuring artillery guns, of course, inside of retractable turrets, while the infantry blocks were mostly based around machine guns. The entrances to these blocks were located almost a kilometer away, and then there would be a really long tunnel, or a kilometer-long tunnel, I guess, that men and supplies had to move through to arrive at the combat areas. Of course, as much of this as possible was all below ground, with primarily only the tops of the retractable turrets and then some fixed observation and weapon cupolas kind of above ground. The central fortifications were then supported by a series of casemates that were more distributed and were not connected to the main fortifications by underground tunnels, and the only way to move men in and out of them was above ground. Now, the artillery guns at Fermont were positioned and instructed to support defenses closer to the German border, specifically the troops that were defending the areas around the city of Longwy. One of the challenges present on this sector of the Maginot Line was that it was not really done during the 1930s. Sure, there were strong defenses like those at Fermont, but there'd been a lot of conversations during the 1930s about how best they could be supported. In 1930, Pétain had made the decision that the previous plan should be abandoned, a plan that would have seen a whole series of ouvrages created around Longwy. And instead of these ouvrages, there were just some blockhouses and some concrete emplacements put in place because they were cheaper, easier, and faster to build. In theory, these could be supported by the artillery positions at Fermont, at least in theory. Now, both sides knew that these positions would be important because if the French maintained control of Longwy, they would be able to prevent the use of the road and rail networks in the area, which would restrict the ability of the Germans to move supplies to the north and to the west. The Germans also knew this, and so this would be an area that would be attacked by the Germans in the opening days of their offensive, even though it was protected by these Maginot defenses. The attacks would begin on May 11th, disrupting the well-practiced rhythm of the defenders that had been in place since the start of the war. The fighting would continue throughout the day, with the German troops of the 17th Infantry Division unable to make real progress directly into Longwy. However, they were able to surround the town. In the morning of the 12th, they would finally come within the range of the guns at Fermont, and which would open fire basically immediately. This fire would continue off and on for the next day, but due to the growing German pressure, the French commander on this sector of the front, General Condé, made the decision to abandon the forward positions around Longwy and instead to pull back his forces to kind of the main line of resistance closer to Fermont and the other fortifications of the Maginot Line. The Germans had accomplished their objective. They took Longwy and they kind of ended their efforts before really testing the Maginot defenses. They just sort of knocked off some of the forwardmost positions that were obviously much weaker. Further to the north and to the west, the Germans would actually test the Maginot defenses near another ouvrage named Ouvrage de la Ferté. La Ferté was a petite ouvrage, or a small fortification, made up of only 2 blocks, and it had a garrison of about 100 men. The 2 blocks were then connected by a deep underground gallery that was reachable via a lengthy series of stairs below both of the combat blocks. On May 13th, the German 71st Infantry Division would move into position to assault La Ferté, staying just out of range of its guns while they prepared for the assault. These German troops had been specially trained for attacking fortifications and were provided with special shaped charges, which had been designed specifically to deal with the Maginot fortifications. They'd even been tested on similar positions that had been built in Czechoslovakia, in the areas that had been ceded to Germany due to the Munich Agreement. The various guns at La Ferté would begin firing any time that the German forces were within range, but over the following days, the Germans pushed around La Ferté to capture nearby objectives and nearby hills. These attacks really highlighted the weakness present in all of the Maginot defenses. They were only as strong as the men between or in the intervals of the ouvrages, because once those interval troops are pushed back, the Germans would have much more freedom to close in and damage the actual fortifications. This is exactly what would happen at La Ferté, because even though the guns were firing at the Germans as much as possible, and they were joined by nearby fortifications like other ouvrages, the guns themselves could not drive the Germans back. There were also a few design issues with La Ferté that exacerbated this problem, most importantly a lack of mortars within the defenses, which created a lot of dead ground around the ouvrage where its guns could not fire, and so the Germans could, if they got to it, they could just kind of hang out in safety. This allowed the Germans to actually take much of the above-ground area and allowed for them to have reasonably free movement, even though they were at times fired at by artillery from other positions. Once the Germans were able to move around somewhat freely on top of the fortifications, There was little that the men inside of La Ferté could do as the Germans destroyed one position after another, either through direct artillery fire or through shaped charges. Eventually, Block 2 was completely incapacitated, and late on the 18th, Block 1 would also be put out of action. This would result in the commander of the Ouvroage, Lieutenant Bourguignon, to request that his troops be allowed to abandon the defenses, but these requests were denied. And instead, his commander believed that the Maginot positions should never be abandoned under any circumstances. This request, the request to abandon La Ferté, was one of the last pieces of communication that would come out of the Ouvroage, and all contact would be lost over the night of the 18th. What happened within the Ouvroage after Block 2 and then Block 1 were put out of action would only become known after the Germans were able to secure the surrounding areas and then enter the fortifications in the last days of May. It took them that long, over a week later, because of the buildup of gases within the fortifications during the fighting, which made entering them quite dangerous. Based on information that was gained after they entered the fortifications, we know that when Block 2 had been assaulted, fires had started in both blocks, and the smoke from those fires, combined with smoke shells and smoke bombs that the Germans had used to conceal their movements, sort of entered into all of the fortifications. This, combined with German fire, forced the occupants of the blocks into the gallery below. And once they were pushed down into the galleries, they were trapped. Without proper ventilation, the levels of carbon monoxide began to grow. Eventually, it overwhelmed their gas masks, and everybody suffocated. A sad, slow death. Earlier this year, I had the privilege of visiting this Ouvroage de La Ferté, and I highly recommend it if you're kind of in this area of France. They've restored some of the areas of the defenses, but others remain much as they were in 1940. We spent a few hours touring the site, and the things that really stuck out to me were just how large the AM turret was. This was the largest turret on top of the fortification, and it was the one that the Germans knocked off of its mountings with some of those explosives. If you do a search for Ouvroage de la Ferté online, the image will probably be one of the very first ones. It just looks like a cupola that's kind of off of its sort of mountings a little bit.
Want to learn how you can make smarter decisions with your money? Well, I've got the podcast for you. I'm Sean Piles, and I host NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast. On our show, we help listeners like you make the most of your finances. I sit down with NerdWallet's team of nerds, personal finance experts in credit cards, banking, investing, and more. We answer your real-world money questions and break down the latest personal finance news. The nerds will give you the clarity you need by cutting through the clutter and misinformation in today's world of personal finance. We don't promote get-rich-quick schemes or hype unrealistic side hustles. Instead, we offer practical knowledge that you can apply in your everyday life. You'll learn about strategies to help you build your wealth, invest wisely, shop for financial products, and plan for major life events. And you'll walk away with the confidence you need to ensure that your money is always working as hard as you are. So turn to the nerds to answer your real-world money questions and get insights that can help you make the smartest financial decisions for your life. Listen to NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
What if I told you the federal agency created to stop another deadly attack like 9/11 has been so focused on detaining and deporting immigrants that the most dangerous threat has been allowed to fester within our borders? On this season of Bad Watchdog, we unpack the Project on Government Oversight's exclusive investigations uncovering the abuse of people in the Department of Homeland Security's immigration detention.
I didn't understand how much immigration policy has affected my life until I actually was at the detention center.
And how another threat has infiltrated the agency's own ranks.
It only takes one insider who has an association with an extremist group like the Oath Keepers to undermine federal law enforcement attempts to go after crimes by groups like these.
Listen and subscribe to Bad Watchdog Season 2 wherever you get your podcasts, starting June 20th.
The other thing that really stuck out to me was how far down the gallery linking the two combat blocks was. It's something like 20 meters below Block 1 and almost 30 meters below Block 2. That's a lot of stairs. And once you get down there, it's pretty claustrophobic in those tunnels. and that's even with proper ventilation and proper lighting. Now, my own personal belief is that it's impossible for the vast majority of people to really understand how someone may have felt in such extreme conditions, like those experienced by the brave French soldiers at La Ferté on the night of May 18th, stuck below ground in the dark and damp conditions with little that they could do other than just sit there. There is nothing that has happened, at least in my life, that allows me to even glimpse for a moment how that must have felt. Fear, the despair, a variety of other feelings, probably. And oddly enough, when I was at De La Ferté, walking through those tunnels, instead of feeling closer to the experiences of those French soldiers, I somehow felt further away. I was standing on the very concrete that they had stood on. But when they were there, they were stuck in a horrible situation. They couldn't breathe. They had their gas masks on. They couldn't move. There were lots of men packed into a small area. I kind of just had to pop up 150 steps and I'd be back in the free air and then off to a bakery for a delicious lunch. They would never leave those tunnels. They had been sent to defend France, and they would do so until their last breath, 30 meters below the Ouvrage de la Ferté. While there were a few exceptions, like the fighting around Longwy or around La Ferté, the vast majority of the Maginot Line would not be directly assaulted by the Germans during their attacks into France. Instead, German Army Group C would be positioned along its length mostly just to keep watch and to ensure that the French did not try to attack out of their lines, and also to pose some level of threat so that the French would hesitate to pull too many troops out of the Maginot Line to send them north where the primary German attack was occurring. On the French side, the Maginot sector was commanded by General Prételat, and when the German attack started, he would be able to call upon 30 divisions for its defense. The majority of these divisions were interval troops, those positioned between the various Maginot fixed fortifications with the goal of preventing any kind of German infiltration attack. From the moment that the Germans crossed the border in northern France, the number of troops available to Prételat would begin to decline, until by May 26th, he was down to just 10 divisions. 6 of these 10 divisions would be classified as B-class divisions, so not the top of the line in terms of equipment or training, and then there would be 2 Polish divisions as well. Now, nobody would ever question the fighting spirit of the Poles, but their equipment and overall organization meant that their combat power as a unit was questionable. On that same day, May 26th, Prételat and Weygand would meet in person, and they would discuss what should be done about the Maginot Line. It had not yet been seriously attacked, but the French situation in the north had continued to deteriorate. By May 26th, the Germans had reached the North Sea and had trapped the troops in Belgium and northern France, and Weygand was frantically trying to throw together enough units to build a defensive line along the Somme. If the Maginot Line was abandoned, the overall length of the French line would be shortened, perhaps freeing up some troops for a reserve. This was the path that Prételat advocated for, due to fears that with so many of his units already removed from their positions throughout the Maginot sector, those within the fixed fortifications were just sitting ducks and served no real purpose. Weygand was quite hesitant to abandon the Maginot defenses, though, for what were, in reality, maybe some reasonable reasons. If the French abandoned the Maginot Line without really fighting for it, the blow to French morale, both in the army and throughout France, would be hard to bear. It had been built up as the greatest series of defenses the world had ever known, the anchor, the rock upon which the enemies of France would break. To then just abandon it, while its defenders and its defenses remained for the most part untried and unconquered, would be hard to bear. This was also the period where Weygand had banked the entirety of France's survival on the ability of the French army to hold the line along the Somme and the Aisne rivers. If those defenses did hold, then holding on to the Maginot positions would be invaluable in the long war to come. Prételat was still concerned about what would happen if the Germans broke through the line on the Somme and the Aisne, as they in fact would, but Weygand simply informed Prételat that if that happened, then France would have to request an armistice anyway, so it didn't really matter. While he found little comfort in this line of thinking, Prételat would meet with General Hunsinger of the French Second Army positioned immediately to the north and to the west of the Maginot Line, and they would try to coordinate what to do in case the line on the Aisne was broken, and how to kind of helped defend the northern reaches of the Maginot Line. Unfortunately, in the actual event, when the Germans crossed the Aisne River and began pushing the French Second Army back, Hunsinger was unable to conform to the plans that he and Prétolat had made, and instead, after the Germans crossed the Aisne, the Second Army began to pull away from the northern Maginot defenses, and they sort of became uncovered and were instantly in danger of being surrounded and destroyed. On June 12th, many of the remaining interval troops along the northern stretches of the Maginot Line began their retreat due to Weygand sending out the general retreat order. They would execute a plan that Prétolat had put in place over the previous days in preparation for this event. Along with the interval troops, some of the defenders of the Maginot fortifications would also join in the retreat, although for many casemates and ouvrages, at least a kind of a skeleton crew of few men would be left behind to continue to fire occasionally to mask the retreat from the Germans. The goal of these skeleton crews was to, be a distraction for a little bit, but then also to disable the fortifications as much as possible before they were then abandoned, which would happen in stages between June 14th and June 17th. However, most of these final orders were not carried out, and few of the defenses were actually destroyed or even abandoned at all by their French defenders, and instead the men inside of them continued to fight on until the armistice. Even though the French were falling apart on almost every other part of the front within the defenses, the fortress crews remained firing until the end of the fighting, inflicting casualties on German forces until the very end. But the end did come, and eventually the defenders would surrender to German forces, although for the vast majority of the defenses, this surrender was not caused by a German assault, but instead due to the wider French surrender. The crews of the Maginot defenses then became prisoners of war, and the ouvrages and the casemates became glorified storage sheds for the Germans for basically the rest of the war, with some of the movable weapons actually being transitioned to the German defenses of the Atlantic Wall. So how do we evaluate the performance of the Maginot Line? There's kind of a few things to consider here. The first is that it was not designed to be an impregnable or impenetrable shield, but instead to simply make it a pain for the Germans to attack into France, so they would attack further north where the French army would be waiting for them. It did exactly that, but the fighting in the north was a complete disaster, in ways that no French planner could have ever anticipated when the Maginot Line was being designed and built. The common criticism I've seen of the Maginot Line is that it was only made to fire one way, right? That it couldn't fire behind itself. But of course that's how it was built. If the line itself was surrounded, then France was already lost, and that's exactly what would happen in 1940. And while individual casemates and ouvrages could be destroyed or defeated, like what was seen at La Ferté, even those smaller defenses that were taken by the Germans took time and effort to assault and to silence. The larger and stronger fortifications were never taken until the war was already lost. And it allowed the French army to defend the entirety of its German border with a small fraction of the forces that would have been required otherwise. And indeed, they pulled out 20 divisions over the course of the campaign that they could reposition elsewhere, validating one of the core reasons for its construction, which was to conserve manpower. The Maginot Line was not perfect. It had its problems, which at times would be taken advantage of by the Germans. But as a whole, it did not fail. Instead, the Maginot Line failed because after the German invasion, the entirety of the French military failed in unexpected and truly spectacular ways. These incredible failures would force the French army to abandon not just northern France, but then also the Maginot Line, and it would cause French leaders to pursue a path of surrender, a path that will be the topic of next episode.